C'est bon. Merci à toutes
Thank
et
you
à
very
tous
much to
d'être là
everyone
pour
for being
ce
here
panel
today
sur
for
le
this
Moyen-Orient
panel on the
en
Middle
tourment.
East in
Alors,
turmoil.
nous avons 1h30
We have an
comme pour
hour
tous les panels
30, as for all
sur un
panels,
sujet, vous le
on a
savez, qui
topic
est
that you know
particulièrement
is
lourd, qui est
especially
particulièrement grave sur
heavy
une région
and
qui va mal.
serious in a
Je ne vous
region that
apprends
is not
rien.
doing well. I'm not
Nous allons
saying
essayer
anything new. We are going
nous
to
allons
try
garder du temps
to keep some
pour
time
discuter après
to
avec
discuss
vous,
after it
avec la
with
salle,
you,
d'abord parce
with
que
the room,
je pense qu'il y aura beaucoup de questions et puis
because I
c'est
believe we will
important
have
aussi
a lot of
d'avoir cet échange.
questions and it's important to discuss.
Un petit mot d'abord pour remercier
First, a
évidemment
word to thank
très
very warmly
chaleureusement les organisateurs
all of the
de
organizers
cette manifestation
of
qui est
this
maintenant
event,
ancrée
which
dans le
is
paysage
now
géostratégique des
something
débats
that
géopolitiques
is every
en
year
France chaque
in
année.
France.
Merci
Thank
à
you
eux
very
aussi
much
d'inviter des
for
lycéens,
having
des
invited
étudiants,
students,
des
high
étudiants
school
aussi
students,
et d'autres
students from the
universités avec
ESSEC
lesquelles
and
nous avons
other
ce
universities with
partenariat
whom we
pour
have
cette
this
table ronde
partnership
aujourd'hui.
for
Donc
this
vraiment
round
merci
table today.
à
So
eux.
a great thank you to all of
Un
them.
petit mot d'abord pour vous
One
présenter
word to present you
rapidement nos intervenants. Nous avons la
quickly
chance pour
the
parler de cette
speakers
région
we are lucky
complexe.
to have with us to talk about this
Aujourd'hui,
region amongst us.
de ma droite à ma
I'm
gauche,
going to do it from my right to my left
le protocole soit clair, il
so
n'est
that the
ni
protocol is clear. It's no hierarchy, it's not alphabetical order, it's not political.
Éric Danon,
Eric
je vais
Danon,
donner les indications
I'm going to
essentielles
give the main indications because obviously they have such a curriculum that we couldn't spend all time mentioning it. He's a diplomat, former French ambassador to Israel, and also speaker in a number of forums. And I know, Eric, that you also like to discuss with the audience and carry out research. Marie Durieux is almost a doctor in political sciences. She has been working on this region and at the Institute of Strategic Studies at the École Militaire and is a teacher at the Sciences Po School in Paris. Fatia Dazieni is also a specialist of the Gulf. She works at the IRSEM. It's almost entirely an IRSEM panel, the Research Center for the Armies, and Joseph Maïla, who is a professor of geopolitics and international mediation at the ESSEC Business School. He was also in charge of foreign affairs. And this is also a voice that we know and that is listened to when speaking about this region. It's wonderful to have specialists of this area. I saw a slide before a document that this forum presents or has created and has anchored itself in the landscape. It's a piece, a listing of countries, and it's very interesting. It's a document I invite you to strongly look at with a certain number of indicators that are references in this landscape to analyze conflicts in the world and for what we are looking into today, the Middle East. Just an introductory word or preliminary word, because we need to give the floor to our guests. It is the moment where we all gather today to talk about the Middle East. It's a moment of uncertainties. Last year, when we met here in Caen for this global Normandy Forum for Peace, we didn't know yet that we were at the eve of the events of October 7th, 2023, that radically changed the face of this region. We had no idea. We were living the last days before that and trusting that maybe this region would be at peace, but now it seems very far away from us. It was just a few days before one of the high responsibles of the administration in the USA said that this region hadn't been so quiet for 30 years. It's a declaration that dates back from the 29th of September by the General Secretary of State. After the Abraham agreements, we had a progressive normalization of diplomatic relationships with Arabic states and Israel after Egypt and Jordan, who had been precursors, but the Palestinian Authority in the 90s, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, the United Emirates, and we were expecting, perhaps, for them to be joined by Saudi Arabia. This was the context of our discussions last year. No use to say that all this seems extremely far now. Today, uncertainty is multiple. Will we have a regionalization or generalization of the conflict in this area? Between the forum last year and this year's forum, 10,000 of deaths. Uncertainties also, perhaps connected to the presidential election in the USA. We do not know much yet, but we have experts with us, people who have a large experience, a broad experience, and will maybe gives us insights or their feelings on what the region is like today. Maybe I'm going to ask Eric Danon first. Eric, this morning, in another discussion, in a plenary session, we heard that the conflict is going to last. As a correlation to this claim, is it going to generalize? The fears expressed everywhere in the United States, Washington, Paris, everywhere, we're maybe on the verge of a general crisis in the Middle East. According to you, is this going to happen? And I'll ask you, of course, to be brief, so that we can have a round of questions, several rounds of questions, and then give the floor to the audience. I think it'll be enough, right? Yes, 5 minutes, of course. It's a great pleasure for me to be among you. We need to be brief, but will the conflict generalize? No. Full stop. That could be enough. In fact, obviously, there will be around Israel, I mean, next to Lebanon, Syria in the east, and then near Gaza, there still will be a war. The world will not stop. But what we call a generalization of the conflict, meaning that all of a sudden it will go to Iran in the western part, in the Mediterranean countries, Egypt, etc. My answer is no. Why? Because all of the actors in the region have an interest in there not having a regional fire there. Or Iraq and Iran do not want this conflict, but the Hezbollah doesn't want it either, Israel neither, and neither do the Arabic Mediterranean countries. When they don't want this kindling or flashover, there is another factor in any case. Arabic countries in the Mediterranean, contrarily to what you may think, do not want the conflict to stop. They want the conflict to pursue, but not making too much noise. The situation doesn't agree with them now, but they want the conflict to continue because it's a good thing for them. Maybe it's counterintuitive for you. It's difficult to understand. Do not forget that at the end of 47, but 1948, halfway through the year, Arab countries refused the partition as offered by the United Nations. They refused this division, a partition, and the Arab countries said no. So it's not that they didn't want to have a Palestinian state, it's that they didn't want this partition as planned by the United Nations. This is completely different. And since then, they still do not want it. Of course, things have evolved, but you will have noticed that most of Arab countries haven't recognized Israel as a state. They all say the Zionist entity.
Ce qui, en revanche,
So what is for sure is that they support what is called the Palestinian cause. And progressively, time going by, they focused their will to fight
les
to have
Palestiniens.
a combat on
Et cette cause
Palestinians. And this
palestinienne,
Palestinian
il faut
cause
qu'elle dure pour
needs
qu'eux-mêmes
to last
puissent continuer
in
leur propre
order for
politique.
them to
Vous avez
pursue
deux
their
éléments
policies. You have
essentiels.
two main elements here.
Le premier,
The
c'est
first
que la cause
is that the
palestinienne est
Palestinian cause
indispensable dans les
is
pays arabes en
necessary
termes
in
de
Arab
politique
countries in terms of
intérieure.
interior
Parce que dès qu'il y a
policies,
une remise en cause
domestic
des
policies.
dirigeants
They
par la
have
population,
the
on
leaders,
sort la cause
and
palestinienne
if you-
et c'est formidable.
it's
Hop,
great
ça
to
repart en
talk
termes
about the
pour
Palestinian
les
cause
leaders
whenever
de
there's
ces
an
pays.
issue.
Le roi Hassan II, le père
King
de
Hassan
l'actuel,
II,
Mohamed
King
VI,
of
vous
the-
trouverez ça
of
partout sur
Mohammed
YouTube,
VI, you'll find this
avait
on
l'habitude
YouTube,
de dire
a
la
habit of
cause
saying that the
palestinienne est
Palestinian cause
l'aphrodisiaque des
is
nations arabes.
an aphrodisiac
Donc s'exprime
for
à travers
Arab
ça quelque chose
nations.
de tout à fait
So this
déterminant.
is something quite
L'intérêt, ça n'est
determining.
pas la
The
paix,
whole interest
l'intérêt,
not being
c'est
peace, the
le
interest
combat
of it
contre
being
ce qui s'est
fighting
passé
against
dans
what
l'histoire.
happened in
Et surtout contre
history
Israël.
and against
Le deuxième élément,
Israel.
c'est
The
que c'est
second
ça qui
element
fait
is that this is what
que les pays arabes arrivent à s'entendre
means
entre eux,
that Arab
surtout
countries
à
can
la
get
Ligue
along,
arabe.
and especially for the
Qu'est-ce que c'est que
Arab
ce truc?
League. What is that?
Les pays arabes,
Arab
ils s'aiment
countries
pas beaucoup
do
entre
not
eux au niveau
like
des
one
dirigeants.
another.
Au niveau de la
Their
population,
leaders
vous avez une
dislike one
arabité
another.
qui fonctionne, mais pensez
People, the
au gouvernement
populations are
algérien par
Arab,
rapport au
they get
gouvernement
along, but
marocain.
different
pas du
governments
tout.
do not like one
Pensez
another.
à la
Think
Libye
about
par
Libya
rapport
when it
à
compared
l'Égypte,
to
par
Egypt,
exemple.
for example.
En fait,
In fact,
qu'est-ce qui les réunit entre eux quand
what
ils sont dans
unites
les
them
réunions
when
communes
they're
de la
in
Ligue
common
arabe?
meetings of
Le
the
rejet
Arab
d'Israël.
League, rejecting
Après le 7
Israel?
octobre,
After
première
October
réunion
7th, the
de la
first
Ligue
meeting of the Arab League
En Arabie Saoudite,
in Saudi Arabia,
ils proposent 20
they
résolutions,
suggest
aucune
20
ne passe, sauf
resolutions.
une, la
None
condamnation
were
d'Israël.
accepted except for the condemnation
C'est
of
ça qui les tient
Israel.
entre eux.
This is what holds
Alors
them
c'est terrible
together,
de cynisme
and
parce
it's
que
very cynical
ça prolonge
because
sans arrêt la
it
guerre
makes
pour les
war
Palestiniens.
last longer
Un
for
jour,
Palestinians.
Devant ce cynisme-là,
And
j'avais demandé aux
confronted to this
Nations Unies,
cynicism,
un
I
responsable
asked the
algérien si
United
justement il trouvait ça
Nations
normal
if they thought it was
que tout ça se
normal
passe sur le dos des
that all
Palestiniens.
of this
Et il m'a
was,
donné cette réponse tout à fait étonnante et très
meaning
cynique.
they accused the
Les
Palestinians. It's
Palestiniens
very
sont les
cynical.
idiots utiles
Palestinians
de la
are
cohésion
the
du monde
idiots
arabe.
of the cohesion of the Arab
Vous voyez
world.
le cynisme
You
de la
see the
phrase.
cynicism
C'est
of this
terrible, d'autant
sentence.
plus
It's
de la part d'un
awful.
Algérien.
And coming
Étant
from an
entendu que s'il
Algerian,
y a bien un pays qui a
and
toujours
if
été
one
fidèle
country has
à la
always
cause
been faithful to the
palestinienne et à la
Palestinian
Palestine,
cause
c'est bien
in
l'Algérie, justement.
Palestine, it's
Donc vous voyez que ce
Algeria.
qui paraît comme
So you
ça,
see what
un bloc
seems
arabe contre Israël,
looks like an Arab bloc
ça marche pas
against
du tout
Israel
comme ça
doesn't
dans
really
la
work,
réalité.
in fact, in
Alors
reality.
pourquoi est-ce que, en
And
plus, il y a
why
deux
do, on
éléments
top of it, we
culturels
have
qui
two
paraissent avec ça,
additional cultural
qui fait que
elements,
c'est
and I'll stop
problématique
at
pour
that
les
afterward.
Arabes
It's an issue for
que ça
Arabs,
s'arrête.
for it to
La
stop.
première, c'est que
The first
Israël
thing
est
is
une
because
puissance
Israel is a
régionale,
power, a regional
économique et
power, an
militaire
economic
très
and
forte.
military power that is extremely strong.
C'est comme ça. Le PIB d'Israël, vous
The
regarderez ça parce que
GDP
ça va
of
vous paraître
Israel, you
étonnant,
can
donc
take a look, it's surprising, but
les datas,
you can look
le
at the
PIB
data.
d'Israël
GDP of
est
Israel
supérieur à la
is
somme
higher
des
than
PIB
the
de tous les
sum
pays
of
qui
all
entourent
the
Israël.
GDPs of countries around it.
Le PIB par
The
habitant
GDP per
d'Israël
capita in Israel
fait jeu égal avec
is equal,
plus fort des pays proches, c'est-à-dire avec celui
well,
des
it's higher
Émirats
to
arabes.
those of United
$10 000
Emirates, and it's
par an et par
$10,000 per
personne de
year
plus
and
que la
per
France.
person more than
Donc vous
France.
voyez qu'il y a une
So you
espèce
see
là, de
that here
difficulté
there's a
à
difficulty to
accepter ça par
accept
les pays arabes et
to have
surtout
this accepted by Arab
que
countries, and
si jamais la guerre s'arrête,
if the war
alors
ever stopped,
Israël
then in
aura une
this
bien
case
meilleure
Israel would
image
have a
dans le
better
monde, parce que
image
ce qui
around the
empêche
world, because
Israël
what
de
prevents
devenir une
Israel
superpuissance,
from becoming a
c'est
superpower
l'image détestable
is
que
the
le pays a dans le
horrible
monde,
image
et
that
c'est toutes les actions de type
countries
BDS
in the world have of
qui le
it,
bloquent
and
dans ses investissements, dans ses
they're blocked in
exportations, etc.
investments, it's
Imaginez un instant
imports,
qu'il y a la
etc.
paix, donc il n'y a
Imagine
plus
there's
de
peace
motif à
and
cela.
no longer a
Israël a un
motive.
boulevard devant lui
Israel have
pour
the
devenir un grand
whole
pays
avenue ahead of
d'échange
it to
avec les États-Unis,
exchange with
l'Europe,
the United
la Chine,
States,
tout ce que
Europe,
vous voulez.
China, and
Et
all
ça,
the
c'est très
rest.
compliqué
This
pour les
is
pays
complicated for
arabes à
Arab
accepter.
countries to
Alors
accept.
donc, ce que vous voyez,
So what you
c'est
see
qu'ils n'ont pas envie
is that they don't
eux-mêmes
want
de participer à cette
to be
guerre.
part
Ils
of
l'ont
this
presque
war.
entièrement
They
délégué
almost
sur la partie
entirely
palestinienne.
delegated it
Et
to
il n'y a pas
Palestine, but
d'embrasement
there's no
régional.
regional
Du côté des
flashover
Palestiniens,
on the
des pays
Palestinian
arabes, mais
side, but
au fond,
in all the
ils
Arab
n'ont pas
countries, but
envie
they do not
de
want
s'impliquer pour eux.
to get involved
Pourquoi?
in their
Encore une fois,
name.
parce qu'ils ont
Why?
besoin
Because they
que le
need
conflit
the
dure.
conflicts to
Alors après,
continue.
deux éléments, et je termine pour pas être
I'll
trop.
give you two further
premier, c'est
elements.
l'Iran.
The first, Iran.
Alors, l'Iran
Iran has
évidemment un objectif
quite
de
obviously an
déstabilisation
objective to
régionale
destabilize the
et est
region.
le seul pays
And
qui
it's
a
the only
écrit,
country
non pas
that
dans sa
has
constitution,
written
mais
down,
dans
not in
un texte
its
à valeur
constitution,
constitutionnelle,
but another
qu'il souhaitait la
text,
destruction
that it
d'Israël.
wanted the
Donc,
destruction
vous
of
avez là,
Israel.
évidemment, une source
So
de
this is a
tension
source of
permanente.
permanent
Il faut donc
tension.
faire en sorte
You need to
que
make sure that
l'Iran soit
Iran
dissuadé
be
d'attaquer.
dissuaded to
Et
take action,
actuellement,
and
cette
currently
dissuasion fonctionne
it
à peu
works
près bien.
to be
Donc,
deterred, and it is
Je ne suis
deterred.
pas trop
So
inquiet
I'm not
sur une
so
guerre
worried
entre
about a war
Israël
between Israel
et l'Iran.
and Iran.
Aucun des deux
None
n'a
of the
intérêt
two
à
has
la
an
provoquer.
interest to
En
provoke it.
revanche,
On the
évidemment,
other hand,
l'Iran utilise ce qu'on
obviously,
appelle des
Iran
proxys
uses
mandataires, les
proxies.
3 H. Les
Three
Houthis
H's,
au
Houthi
Yémen,
in
le
Yemen,
Hamas
Hamas
à Gaza,
in
et
Gaza,
le Hezbollah,
and Hezbollah
au Liban.
in Lebanon.
L'Iran a plus ou
Iran
moins sacrifié
has more or less
son
sacrificed
premier proxy,
its
les
first
Houthis,
proxy, the
qui ne
Houthis,
sont pas complètement tapés,
who
mais
are not
qui ont une
haven't
capacité
completely
militaire
disappeared.
faible désormais. Ils peuvent envoyer
But
un
they have a
missile de temps
lesser
en temps,
capacity. They can
militairement,
send a missile,
fini.
but
Il a
militarily
sacrifié le
speaking,
deuxième
it's not
avec le Hamas.
at the
Le
right
Hamas,
level. The
en
Hamas,
termes de militaire,
in
est
terms of military
tué à
force,
80%
is
en termes de
killed at
capacité
80% in terms of their
militaire. La
military
guerre
capacity.
s'arrêtera
The war will
avec
stop
le Hamas
with
si
Hamas
symboliquement,
if symbolically
quelque chose de nouveau se passe,
something new
c'est-à-dire
takes place,
deux hypothèses.
meaning
La
two
mort
assumptions:
de,
the death
de Yahya Sinwar,
of
le
Yahya
dernier,
Sinwar,
pourrait-on dire, patron
the
du
last
Hamas,
being
pas
the head of the
encore tué.
Hamas, who is
Là,
not
si
yet
Israël le
killed.
tue
If
dans les
Israel
15 jours
kills
qui viennent,
him
la
in the
guerre
next 15 days, the
s'arrête.
war
Et
will
ou bien,
stop.
l'autre événement de
Other
rupture,
event
c'est
that would create a
si par une
rupture
opération
if
quelconque, les
by
otages
an operation
israéliens sont libérés.
hostages
Parce que
were
là, il n'y a
free.
plus de légitimité
Were free.
à
There's
continuer
no
la guerre.
longer a
Donc,
legitimacy to
vous
pursue
avez
the war. So
une
you
guerre qui va
have a
durer,
war that will
sauf
last
l'événement de rupture.
unless there's this
Mais
rupture
c'est
or
le sacrifice,
breakup
pourrait-on dire, par
event.
l'Iran du Hamas. Arrive le troisième,
Then
de Hezbollah.
third, Hezbollah.
Et là, pour
In
l'Iran,
this case, for Iran,
c'est en fait assez
it is
dangereux
in fact
d'envoyer
quite
le
dangerous
Hezbollah
to
parce que
send
c'est
the
sa
Hezbollah
dernière
because it's
défense.
its last
Après, il sera en
defense.
direct l'Iran.
Otherwise, they'll be
Avec-
facing
Donc, je ne
directly
crois pas
Israel. So I do
à
not
ce
believe
sacrifice-là.
in this
Le
sacrifice. Hezbollah
a déclenché
has
quelque chose là.
launched
Est-ce que
something,
vous
has
avez tous
triggered
l'impression
something.
que
Do
c'est
you all
Israël
feel
qui a
that
répliqué et qui a
Israel has
attaqué
been the
le
one to
Hezbollah? Mais
answer
ça
and
fait 10
attack
mois que
Hezbollah? In fact, for 10 months,
bombarde,
the Hezbollah has
essaye
been
d'envoyer des
bombing or
missiles, des
sending
roquettes
missiles
tous
or
les jours,
rockets on a
tous les
daily
jours
basis
depuis la fin octobre.
since end of
Et
October.
le Hezbollah a
And the
toujours dit,
Hezbollah
le jour où
always
la guerre,
announced that the day the
à Gaza
in
s'arrête,
Gaza
nous nous
ends,
arrêtons.
we will
Donc
stop.
on voit bien que c'est un
So we
soutien,
clearly see
sûr,
this is
mais
a
c'est un
support
soutien simplement au Hamas.
to Hamas.
Donc, il n'a pas envie de faire la guerre.
They don't want to wage war
Les
as such,
Israéliens,
but
je peux le dire de
Israelis, and I
l'intérieur,
can
n'ont
say it from the
aucune envie
inside, have no
de
desire
rentrer au Liban,
to
de
go
continuer
to
la
Lebanon
guerre. Ils
to
ont aucune
pursue
envie,
the
c'est que ça
war.
s'arrête
They
avec
only
le
wanted
Hezbollah
to stop
très vite.
with
Mais
Hezbollah and very
il y a un vrai
quickly.
problème de
But
politique
there's a true
intérieure. Il
issue
faut que les
of
Israéliens qui ont été
domestic
déplacés du nord vers le
policies,
sud à
and
cause des bombardements du
because
Hezbollah
of the bombing of
puissent
Hezbollah,
rentrer chez
they,
eux. C'est maintenant un exercice-
people need to be able to
un objectif de
come
politique
home.
intérieure
It's
clé
a
pour
key
Netanyahou. Et
part
donc,
for
je
Netanyahu.
pense qu'il peut y avoir de
And
la
I
trêve.
believe
Je
there
pense
could
pas
be
que
a
ce
truce.
soit intéressant comme
I'm not
objectif
sure
stratégique,
it's
ni pour le
interesting
Hezbollah,
for
ni
Hezbollah or
pour, Israël,
for Israel
d'aller trop loin
to
dans
go
cette-
too
dans cette
far
guerre.
in
Donc
this
voilà
war.
où nous en sommes.
So this is where
Le
our
système
position
ne va
now,
pas
where we stand.
s'étendre
It's
dans
not
tout
going
le
to
Moyen-Orient
extend in the
et
entire
il y a
Middle
ce
East.
délire
And I hate
journalistique
these
sur
journalistic
l'embrasement de
deliriums to
l'ensemble
see
de la région,
talk about
etc.
this flashover
Vous allez
kindling
avoir
of the Middle
une guerre
East. You will have a
limitée. On est
limited
presque
war.
à la fin
We are
de
almost
la
at the
guerre,
end of the war
à Gaza,
in Gaza.
et au bout du compte,
And
c'est
in
vrai
the end,
que
it is
la
true
question
that the question
de l'élection
of
américaine
the presidential
a
election
été
in the
clé et
USA
reste clé
is
jusqu'au
key
5
and
novembre,
will remain
date de
key
l'élection
until
présidentielle
the
américaine.
beginning of November
Pourquoi?
when the elections
Parce que
take place.
Netanyahou,
Why? Because
depuis le début,
Netanyahu,
ne veut
since
pas
the
faire le
beginning,
cadeau
doesn't want
d'un
to
cessez-le-feu ou de la paix à
offer
Biden.
this
Il n'aime
gift
pas.
of
Il
a
veut faire le
ceasefire
cadeau
to
de la
Biden.
paix
It wants
à
to
son ami
offer
Donald
peace
Trump,
to
dont
his
il
friend
attend
Donald
l'élection
Trump,
au
who's
5 novembre,
awaiting
et
the
tout le monde
elections.
est dépendant en réalité
And
de
in
cette
reality,
dimension
this
psychologique
psychological
de Netanyahou.
aspect needs to be taken into account. Eric, thank you very much. And
Il y a une région
there's a
qui est clé
region
aussi
that is
dans
key
cette affaire,
in
qui est la
this,
péninsule du Golfe.
the Gulf Peninsula.
Fatia, tu connais
Fatia,
cette
you know
région.
this region
Il y a
very
un certain
well.
nombre de
There
diplomaties
are diplomacies that are expected now and are increasing, not as much as wished, but not as fast as desired. But there's a giant, Saudi Arabia, in the region, one power growing, the Emirates, and the United States called it the new Sparta of the Middle East. There's the role of Qatar, that is often an engine in a number of negotiations, the others also, but maybe to a lesser extent. How, since the Gulf, do we react? How do governments, diplomacies in the Gulf react, and what can they do faced with this situation today?
Thank you, Frédéric. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for the warm welcome from the Forum, Normandy Forum, which is wonderful. Indeed, I will now focus on what I know best. For the last 25 years or so, the Arabic Peninsula, indeed, which is the new in the Arab country, the new diplomatic hub of all of diplomacies. When I talk about the Arab world, I'm sure you understood from the previous speaker that there isn't such a united world as such. The Arabic Peninsula, with three diplomatic stakeholders, which are rather proactive, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, and Qatar. These three countries did not really show a success in their diplomacy during this year of war in Gaza, which I spread also to the West Bank with an illegal occupation in southern Lebanon as well, which has also spread through the Houthis' attacks. Even if you want to nuance to the extreme this, still for the last year or so, this has disturbed one of the main trade routes in the world, where 12% of the global trade goes through. This is a non-state actor, the Houthis, close to Iran, yet mostly engaged over the last 10 years in a war with Saudi Arabia. And today they come across as the most spectacular actor in order to show themselves or present themselves as the savior of the Palestinian cause, the United Arab, the small Kingdom of Bahrain, which are the first signatories of the Abraham Agreements signed under the auspices of Trump in 2020, September 15. This showed largely that the Palestinian cause had been completely left aside, because the Abraham Agreements do not tackle the Palestinian issue and do not mention a solution for the future Palestinian state, which is why Saudi Arabia, which is engaged in trilateral negotiations with the US and with Israel, in order to pretend having a normalization of their relationship with Israel, and all the media in the world had bet on the fact that just before October 7th, Saudi Arabia would sign this normalization of their relationship with Israel. This was ultra-politicized by Washington and Tel Aviv. I can say that as I saw this from close, in the Saudi media, the declaration of the Prince of the Heir went on the 21st of September 2023, when the Prince made this declaration to Fox News. He was playing the game of the electorate of Donald Trump, meaning that they heard what they wanted to hear, meaning that they would be so close to a signature of those agreements, but actually the conditions were not acceptable for Israel at the time, and they still aren't acceptable. Therefore, the fact that Saudi Arabia and the heir prince, which wants to normalize their relationship with Israel, and because in Saudi Arabia we have today a monarchy which has become more and more authoritarian. Not to say that it was a democracy before, but the monarchy system now is more authoritarian, meaning that one person before, at least, could not impose their will on the rest, which was the case before, but is no longer true. Now everyone else has to be quiet. I knew many Saudi stakeholders and many people from the civil society. Saudi society remains strongly pro-Palestinian and hostile to any normalization agreement with Israel, especially as part of the Abraham agreements, which is why the prince, the heir prince, was clever enough by pretending that this would be the case, but certainly not as part of the Abraham agreements, because Saudi Arabia, even though this is a country that is opening up, that wants to become a high-tech and superpower economic power, and to get rid of its Middle Ages background, this is a place where the heart of Islam is. So even as a heir, as a prince, he can't do whatever he wants. I think recently, mid-August, in front of American Congress people, he clearly said, my life is threatened if I want to normalize my relationship with Israel. You can say whatever you want about MBS, still he has a full knowledge of his cultural history and policies of his country. Unlike his brothers or uncles, he never left the country, so he knows very well the culture of his country, the people, the society. He knows what he's talking about. So when many observers say this is just pretending to obtain a number of guarantees, what he's actually saying is that he's putting in place a treaty of global security with the US. Even though those countries have diversified their partnership greatly, because the superpower of America is no longer this unilateral power that rules international order. International order is no longer as it used to be, so they have also brought in new partners such as China, India, and other Muslim powers such as Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., in order to diversify their partnership, including Russia as well, so that they would no longer have to align themselves to American positions with whom they had in the past many more interests. So they are trying to set up some multi-alignments and therefore a willingness to be detached from America. However, with the extension of the war in Gaza, the heir prince is balancing the normalization of the relationship with Israel against a treaty agreement in writing with the possibility to cooperate on civil nuclear with the US. And an easiness of access to the nuclear market, and the American government is not ready to abide by this. So this is what's happening and what is being negotiated in the back room. So we are far from the Palestinian cause here, but still the Palestinian cause is a kind of adjustment variable. And I will end with this, and we can come back to that point in our discussion. Still, there is a contrast in the Arabic Peninsula between the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who chose to either normalize or now or in the future the relationship, and public opinion, even though these are countries which have put in place a system with cyber, with the control of social media, a surveillance system which is quite developed and sophisticated. Populations, of course, will not go in the streets to demonstrate because their families, even abroad, could be pursued. So this is very deterring but still the opinion is no longer against what they see. And then Bahrain, such a small country which has to take on responsibilities which the Emirates and Saudi Arabia are not taking on. The Emirates are not taking part in the Operation Guardian's Prosperity because they are afraid of Iran and they don't want the Houthis to start throwing missiles on their federation. So that's why Bahrain is the only one to take part in this maritime operation to counter Houthis. Now, you have other countries such as Kuwait, where societies are more politicized, be it the governments or the societies. These are all very much pro-Palestinian, at least societies of these other countries. They are going through a period of transition with a new sultan, who is trying to make a stand against his predecessor, who reigned for 50 years. But the new sultan is showing a willingness to let the population express their views, and through the social media, through the demonstrations which are taking place both in Kuwait and Bahrain, where people can manifest and demonstrate, that's where we see that Hamas and Houthis have actually gained in popularity, whereas these actors were enemies of the leaders of all these regions. This is a very highly and very contrasted situation. Now, in terms of a lack of mobilization and action to try to influence on the war in Gaza. Of course, these countries have lost a lot of credibility, but not them alone. The EU, also the US and the international community also have lost credibility. Now, there's another region, actually, it's not another region, but another point of attention, of course, is Lebanon. When we talk of Lebanon, besides all the issues that, unfortunately, poor Lebanon has experienced over the last few years, Hezbollah at the heart of all the latest news. We've seen Hezbollah as an addition to a number of other stakeholders. How can we interpret? How can we explain the strategy of Hezbollah on this front? And what about poor Lebanon in all of this? Thank you all for being here. Frédéric, you asked a question to which we're supposed to answer in 4 or 5 minutes. Everyone did it in about 12 minutes, but I will try to address the issue of Lebanon within the framework which has been already explained of this regional context in the Middle East, or in the context of the Gulf. Now, looking back a bit, let's try to understand how it all started. The basic idea here, which was put forward by Iran with a genius general, it was really to circle Israel at the time by creating around Israel a kind of a belt of insecurity, meaning Gaza, followed by the West Bank. We haven't spoken much about the West Bank. And if I continue looking at all the countries around Israel, you've got Syria. Syria could have been part of that front as well, the front line, but is not. Why? Good question, to which it is difficult to answer. Remember one thing, however, in Syria, Russia has 2 bases, a maritime and an air base. And very quickly, the Russian leaders made the Iranian leaders that there was no way that Russia was going to enter this conflict. An extension of this conflict in Syria would involve Russia straight away. And as you know, Russia is busy elsewhere in Ukraine. So there was no point in being involved in what was going on in the Middle East, and Iran being very important as well. We know that there were some interviews between Shoigu, who is the Minister of Defense, and Khamenei, who is the president, the supreme guide of the Iranian revolution, and they were told that they are too important, Iranians are too important because they manufacture low-cost missiles that they throw on Kiev regularly, so therefore they told them not to get engaged in this war. As we heard, Iranians do not want to get involved in this war. Let's continue now with the Houthis. Houthis are a bit further away. So all of these people are equipped with weapons from Iran. Hezbollah does not have a research center like the CNRS in France. These are guns and weapons given by Iran. Houthis were told to be quiet. A couple of weeks ago, the harbor on the Red Sea was burning for 3 days because of a ballistic missile that Israel sent, but Israel did not claim this strike. So in this context, the strategy that I'm talking about with the Iranian general is just simply failing. The unity of the various front lines did not take place. The various fronts just collapsed one after the other, except the Hezbollah front. Now, when we come to the Hezbollah, first of all, this is a country that has lost all authority and all authority on the Hezbollah. There is a Lebanon state, but Hezbollah is a state within the state. Hezbollah is a state in which Lebanon is. I'm just summarizing, meaning that the Hezbollah has a full control on the borders, on the harbors, on the airport, on drug trafficking, on domestic traveling. So this Hezbollah has taken over the state of Lebanon. Hezbollah can also do without the money from Iran, but Hezbollah is between 20 to 40,000 men. This is a well-trained army. They have learned to fight. They have trained in Syria during the war. They send their soldiers to get trained in Iran. So between 20 to 40,000 men in Hezbollah. Israel does not want to be involved in this crisis, and they're very cautious in that respect. However, the Hezbollah front might kindle all of the region, or the whole situation in all of the region. Why? Because a war, which is not inevitable, it is inevitable, but at any moment an incident can occur along the way. Missile reaching a point in Israel could cause some reactions. Therefore, we could measure the scope of this crisis. So this is an important front. However, Israel got some point there in their strategy of counterattack. You all know, you all heard about the beepers that exploded a few days ago, which were means of connection between the highest authorities of Hezbollah. This was an order of 5,000 beepers and walkie-talkies, which exploded all together at the same time and which decimated the 16 most important leaders, military leaders of Hezbollah in a few seconds. The others, because of this infiltration, others were injured, either had their eyes injured, either had some fingers torn, or their hips damaged. And according to the Lebanese hospitals, we consider that 500 people lost sight during these explosions. So Israel has been decapitating or disseminating the Lebanese front by reaching out to the leaders. Now, to answer the question that you were asking earlier on, yes, it's difficult to predict what the extension of this conflict would be, and the Iranian leader said it yesterday at the UN. We are not hostile to Americans. We love Americans. This was a love declaration, which is quite unusual for Iran. But still, there is a willingness really to negotiate with America the most important status for Iran, and that is the nuclear status, meaning how far can they go in the development of their nuclear and atomic arsenal. As you know, that proliferation is forbidden, especially when it is done for military purposes. It's the Treaty of July 1st, 1968, which bans or forbids this. There is therefore a negotiation between America and Iran, which means that the conflict is controlled in that respect. But the Lebanese front has been activated, not like a volcano, but which at any time could question the regional balances or balance of powers. So I probably agree with what has been already said around this table, but we must pay attention to any unexpected events, to any side events, because the solution has not yet been found to any skidding. So what do we do after we have finished the war? What kind of agreements are we aiming at? So I think the most important question here, and Marie Durieux is going to talk about this now, she's going to talk about the West Bank, and the West Bank is really the future of the Palestinian state with Gaza. And it all happens between the West Bank and Gaza, with another important aspect which we haven't mentioned. I forgot to mention it this morning, actually, and that is the issue of Jerusalem. The attack of the Hamas is Tawafan for Arab speakers, which means the typhoon of Al-Aqsa. What is Al-Aqsa? Al-Aqsa is a mosque which is built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the mosque. The destruction of the mosque by Titus army, which destroyed the temple. So the issue is to know whether or not there will be a Palestinian state, with which capital between West Bank and Gaza. And when, of course, the question of the capital is raised, and you mentioned Jerusalem, Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, the 3H, as we were told, are all pro-Palestinian or Palestinian organizations which are Islamic. I'm not talking about being Muslim. There are Muslims in the regions, and you have Israelites, and you have Christians. But the radicalization is religious first and foremost. It is motivated by religious reasons. When Hamas speaks, they say they want to see Islam triumph. Same for Houthis and Hamas. So we must keep that dimension also in mind. Thank you very much, Joseph. So now, Marie, just before, actually last autumn, while we were all here during the forum talking about this region, you were both in the West Bank and in Israel back then. So what lessons, after all that has happened, what lessons can we draw, can we learn from this situation? What lessons can you learn from what you have seen and observed during that time after everything that has happened, which we know now, which we did not know, of course, back then when you went? And thankfully you went there just before.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. I'm delighted to be with you. It's a great honor. So to complement to what came before me and talked about the region, I am going to refocus on what I saw on the ground. I was there in September 2023, and I came back on the 30th of September, and so before the 7th of October, and I'd like to give you my main conclusions of what I saw on the field, and maybe leads of reflection around peace and after Gaza. The first great conclusion that does not date back from the last investigation on the field, but that is anchored in the experience. When you're there in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, the nature of the conflicts gets clearer. Often there are mix-ups with why the conflict was born. And it is a conflict that is a territorial conflict, square meter by square meter. The essence of the problem is that two peoples want the same land, and this is where, when one wins, the other loses. When you're there, you see the tools and the territorial weapons that are used in order to cover land square meter after square meter. On the Israeli side, the main tool, if I may say, is colonization, and whenever I go there, I am struck by the multiplication of the colonies. We see them next to Palestinian cities, we see them alongside roads, colonies that have settled in some streets in some cities of the West Bank, in the Palestinian streets. And another tool, a territorial tool, the military presence of Israel in Palestinian territories that is blatant. I'm going to take an example. On the road from Ramallah to Naplouse, approximately every 500 meters, you have shelters with military Israelis ready to shoot. Then the construction of the wall. It was supposed to be built as a security and was to follow the green line defined by the UN. But this wall was built more to the east than the green line, and whereas the green line was supposed to be 300 kilometers long, 315 to be precise, the wall will be more than 700 kilometers, with all of the detours that helps eat up more Palestinian land. You see that these territorial tools exist, and for the moment, the Israelis are winning this territorial battle. On the Palestinian side, there's a real fight to keep the land. One example, the Palestinian refugees who are expelled from their cities, villages, for most of them decide to stay and live in refugee camps in the Western Bank or in Gaza, because for them it's a way of resisting. A young Palestinian girl told me next to Bethlehem, she said, by staying here I am resisting, and she adds, until my death. And more radically, Palestinians who commit terrorist actions in public Israeli spaces in a certain way also are trying to lead this fight by terrorizing the populations so that these people do not feel safe in these collected territories. It's important to bear in mind the whole essence of this conflict, which is a territorial one, because to bring an answer that is relevant, you need to understand it in all its complexity. I'll say something that's on the side. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and namely for a few years, and the hostage groups, the Hamas, on the Palestinian side, and also certain ultra-Orthodox parties. On the Israeli side, we have this religious aspect that adds itself to the conflict and needs to be tackled. The second great conclusion on the field, which is very striking, and we need to be aware of it, it's the involvement that characterizes this conflict, in my opinion. And I think the ambassador talked about it this morning, but it is a territory that is extremely small, reduced, everything is intertwined. Is the Israeli and Palestinians need to have to live together, whether the wall, linguistic separations, religious separations are all artificial in reality, and all of this makes the conflict very complex. We need to take this into account to solve the issue. The city of Jerusalem, as was mentioned by Joseph Maria, embodies this intertwining, and from one street you move from the Arab neighborhood to the Jewish neighborhoods. You can go on the esplanade of the mosque through the walls
J'en ai parlé
implanté
dans des rues d'Hébron, qui est une ville palestinienne en Cisjordanie. Passe des tourniquets d'une rue à l'autre pour passer des rues sur les colonies israéliennes aux rues palestiniennes. Et par exemple, le tombeau des patriarches à Hébron a été divisé en deux. D'un côté, une mosquée,
divided
de
in
l'autre
two,
côté,
a
une
mosque on the
synagogue.
one side and a synagogue on the other. All of this to say that these are examples, but it is a conflict in which both peoples are close together, and we cannot
Où une fois réglé,
look
chacun
at it as a
repartira chez soi.
conflict in which everybody can
Quand
go
on aura
home
construit la paix, les Palestiniens et les
once
Israéliens
peace
devront vivre ensemble. Et il
comes
me semble que
back.
c'est un point
They
intéressant.
will have to
Ceci
need,
dit, pour
they
revenir
will
plus
need to live
directement à la
together.
question qui m'a été
To
posée
come
par
back to
Frédéric
the
Charion,
question asked to me by Frédéric
troisième
Charion,
point que je tire
a third
pour le coup de mon dernier déplacement
aspect
qui date
that
de
I-
septembre 2023.
with my
Ma grande
experience
conclusion en
in
revenant de
last
cette enquête de terrain était de dire qu'il y avait une
My
violence
investigation leads me
latente.
to say
Pour le
that there's a
pour le coup, je n'ai pas mis les pieds
latent
à
violence, and I
Gaza.
haven't
Je parle
stepped foot in
essentiellement de la
Gaza. I'm talking
Cisjordanie.
about the
Mais
West
malgré
Bank.
ça, j'avais
Despite
ressenti
of
une
it, I
violence
felt
latente et je
latent
trouvais que la
violence, and I
situation
thought that the
s'était
situation
largement dégradée depuis mes
had
derniers
degraded since
déplacements.
my last
J'étais face à une
traveling.
population
I was
palestinienne qui
faced
est
to a
complètement
Palestinian
désespérée.
population
Il y avait
that
plus
is
d'espoir
desperate.
politique
There was
avec
no
une
more
autorité
political hope
palestinienne totalement
with a
corrompue,
Palestinian
délégitimée et paralysée.
lead that
Il n'y
is
avait plus
corrupt.
d'espoir de
There's no
négociation
longer a hope
avec
of a
les
negotiation
Israéliens
with
où
Israelis
le gouvernement
or the government.
était en train de se radicaliser.
The
avec
government was
l'extrême droite,
radicalizing with the
nationaliste,
extreme
ultra-orthodoxe.
right,
Donc, il n'y
the
avait plus aucun espoir de
orthodox
négociation.
movements, and
Et
no
troisièmement, plus
possibility to
aucun espoir
negotiate, and
du
no
côté
hope on
international,
the
puisque la question
international side,
palestinienne
since
n'était
the
plus
Palestinian
vraiment à l'agenda des
issue wasn't
préoccupations
on the agenda
internationales
of
avant le
international
7 octobre. En témoignent les
preoccupations
accords d'Abraham qui ont été
before
mentionnés
the Abraham
précédemment. Donc j'étais face à une population
negotiations
palestinienne
which was
totalement
mentioned
désespérée,
before. So the
surtout chez les
population
jeunes.
is totally
Et
desperate,
l'idée qu'ils
especially
n'avaient
the
plus
young
rien à
people.
perdre
They had
gagnait les
no
esprits.
longer
Et
anything
alors
to
qu'avant,
lose.
les gens parlaient de paix, de
Before,
solution à
people
deux
were
États.
talking about
Là, plus
peace.
personne ne parlait de solution à deux États,
Now
de
there were
négociation.
no
Tout le monde parlait
longer
unanimement
a
de fin de
possibility, and they were
l'occupation et
talking
de
about the end
résistance par
of
tous
the
les moyens.
occupation and resisting
Donc,
until
j'avais
the
vu cette
end
évolution.
by all means.
Ce que j'en avais tiré, c'est qu'il y a une violence latente qui est prête à
I
exploser.
drew
Puis
from
7 jours
this
après,
is
quand
that
je suis
this
rentrée en France,
latent
il y a eu le
violence, and
7
when I came back
octobre.
to France,
Mais au-delà
the
de
7
ça, je pense qu'il
October
ne faut pas
happened.
sous-estimer à quel
We
point ça
mustn't
bouillonne
underestimate
aussi en Cisjordanie.
how
Et d'ailleurs, avant le 7 octobre,
the
depuis le début de l'année
turmoil does
2023, il y
exist
avait eu
there,
de
and
nombreuses attaques de ce
before
qu'on
there were a
appelle les
number
loups
of
solitaires,
attacks,
c'est-à-dire des Palestiniens qui
lone wolves
unilatéralement
attacks.
fonçaient dans un checkpoint,
They
tiraient sur des colons. Et donc, ça
drove
témoigne
into
de
a
cette
checkpoint,
violence
or
qui
this
bouillonne et qui
violence
peut
that is
monter.
bubbling and
Et je
could
pense qu'il faut en
increase.
tenir en
I
compte,
think
il
this
faut
must be taken
donner
into account.
à
We
cette
must
jeunesse
give this
palestinienne en
Palestinian
Cisjordanie,
youth in the West Bank
des bouts d'espoir pour stopper cet
bits of
engrenage
hopes
qui,
to
je pense,
stop
est en
this
train de
situation, to put an
s'accélérer
end to it,
avec,
because it's
la
only
situation à
ramping up
Gaza et à
with
quel
the
point ils sont
situation
témoins
in
de ce qui est en
Gaza,
train de se passer
and they're
à Gaza.
witnesses of what is happening
Dernier
there.
point,
My
je
last
terminerai
point,
sur
and
ça,
I'm
une
going to
dernière
close on this,
observation.
my
Pour
last
le coup, du côté israélien,
observation on the
j'avais
Israeli
observé
side.
une sorte
I saw an
du
invisibilization
problème
of
palestinien
the
qui m'a
Palestinian
énormément
issue,
étonnée.
which really
Quand je
surprised
parlais
me.
à mes
When I
interlocuteurs
talked
israéliens, j'avais du
to
mal à les faire
people in
parler
Israel, it was difficult to
du
make
sujet
them speak
palestinien.
of
Ils
the
parlaient
Palestinian
volontiers de
issue.
la
They
menace iranienne,
were
des
willing
accords
to talk
d'Abraham,
about
de leur nouvelle
Abraham
relation avec les
agreement, their
Juifs.
new
Mais j'avais vraiment du
relationships
mal
with
à les faire parler
countries,
des Palestiniens
countries,
et
but
du
it was
problème
difficult to talk
palestinien.
about the problem
Je
in
pense que je
with
parle sous le contrôle de
Palestinian
l'ambassadeur
Palestinian
qui connaît
people.
Israël depuis plus longtemps que
And I
moi,
think
mais je
the
pense
ambassador has
qu'il y a-
known
que
this
c'est le
country
fruit
for longer
et
than
le
me, but it is
résultat
the
d'une
fruit and the
stratégie
result of a
d'invisibilisation
invisibilization
qui a au moins en partie
strategy
été mise en
that has
place par,
partly
le
been
gouvernement
implemented by the
depuis
Netanyahu
plusieurs
government
années.
for several
Je
years.
pense que
I
Netanyahou
believe
a
that
volontairement
Netanyahu
fait un
voluntarily
écran de fumée et essayé
made a
de faire diversion,
smokescreen
faisant
and
oublier
to
la
create a
question
diversion
palestinienne à la
and
fois à sa
help forget
population
the
et
Palestinian
aux
issue
acteurs régionaux
to all
en mettant
of
l'accent sur la menace
the
iranienne
people
et
and putting
en
the
entretenant le
Iranian
narratif
threat
qui
at the
consiste à dire que
forefront
de toute
and
façon il n'y a pas
telling a story
d'interlocuteur du
that's saying
côté
there's
palestinien
no
et que donc,
spokesperson on the
on ne peut pas
Palestinian
régler
side,
cette
so we cannot
problématique.
solve
Et je pense
this
que c'est
issue.
important
I believe
d'avoir
it's
en tête
important to
cette,
bear in
cette
mind this
invisibilisation du problème
invisibility
palestinien
of
parce
the
que pour régler un
Palestinian
problème
issue. To
encore,
solve an
faut-il,
issue,
en avoir
you need to
conscience
be aware of
et,
it
être disposé à le
and
traiter.
be available to tackle it. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions and maybe
Par les panélistes, mais il va y avoir pas mal de
we'll
questions.
have a lot of questions in the room. If we summarize, well, not everything, it's impossible, it's too rich. A great thank you to the four of you. If we summarize roughly, and this is my job here, what was said, we were in a situation where we thought that the Palestinian issue was moving away from the agenda, the international agenda, but by exploding on the 7th of October in everyone's faith, it highlighted the fact that we couldn't do without a solution to the conflict the Palestinian conflict. But at the same time, what just happened made this peace more than ever necessary. It is also made more than ever impossible, since on both sides we don't want, and it is very clearly understandable, we don't really want to make peace. And thirdly, if we summarize further what was said, we are in the aftermath of October 2023. We are in a situation of a fear of the widening of the conflict. And obviously, those who talked said that none of the major powers in this drama want the full flashover, but unfortunately, we have known it in history, and this is where we stand. I think there are a number of questions. Maybe, Eric, you want to say a word?
Non, juste pour les étudiants.
Yes, for the students who are present, please bear in mind
Le Proche-Orient ou le
that the Middle
Moyen-Orient
East
ne sera jamais
will
calme
never be
tant que
quiet
la
or
question
calm
palestinienne
as
n'aura
long
pas
as the
été réglée.
Palestinian question is not
Vous
resolved.
pouvez toujours essayer de
You can
construire des
always
choses,
try to
d'avoir,
build
de
things,
vivre
to live
en paix, mais
in
ça ne sera
peace,
pas la paix.
but it
Et la
won't be
paix,
peace.
c'est vraiment la
Peace
question du
is
règlement
really a
de
question
la
of
question
the
palestinienne.
settlement of
Donc,
this
elle avait été
Palestinian issue.
mise, c'est vrai, un peu
It is
de
true.
côté. Elle
It
revient
was pushed
aujourd'hui.
aside
En
for a
fait,
while.
elle
It's coming back
n'avait
now.
pas vraiment
It hadn't
disparu.
really totally disappeared.
Je dirais
But I'd say that,
aussi que, comme je l'ai dit ce
as
matin,
I said this
la
morning,
paix,
peace
c'est aussi une
is
question
also a
d'hommes,
question
de femmes,
of men,
politiques,
women,
capables de
politicians
faire la paix.
able to make
Aujourd'hui,
peace.
vous ne les avez pas en
Today,
place.
they are not there.
Avec Netanyahou d'un
With
côté,
Netanyahu
Mahmoud
on
Abbas
one
de
side,
l'autre,
Mahmoud
vous pouvez pas
Abbas
faire
on
la
the
paix.
other, no
Ils
peace is
sont,
possible.
voilà, ils sont pas dans une
They're
disposition
not
d'esprit ou dans une
available
capacité
for
politique
that or
à faire la paix. Il y a
to
eu
make
des hommes
peace. There were
capables
men
de faire la
and
paix. Par le
able
passé,
to make
on le
peace
voit
in the
avec les
past. We
accords
saw it with the
d'Oslo,
Oslo Agreement.
Généralement, ça finit mal pour eux.
Generally, it ends
Mais
badly
en
for
tout cas,
them.
ils avaient cette
But at
capacité.
least
Comme
they
j'ai
had
dit ce
this
matin, ne sont
ability.
pas De Gaulle et Adenauer
It's not
qui
De
veulent.
Gaulle, Adenauer
Et
who wants to be.
aujourd'hui, c'est quelque chose qui nous
Today,
manque
this is something that we
profondément.
are
Enfin,
deeply
c'est un
missing, and
conflit
it
à
is a
multiples
conflict
causes,
that has
y
multiple
compris
causes,
historiques,
including
symboliques,
historical, symbolic,
territoriales,
territorial,
religieuses,
religious, etc.
Marie a parfaitement
Marie
raison. La
is
question
right.
principale,
The
la
main
cause principale,
issue
c'est la question territoriale.
is a
Mais ça n'est pas
territorial
la
one,
seule.
but it's not
Si
the
vous
only
avez
one.
5
If you
causes
have
et
5
chacune
causes and
est
each
un
one
facteur bloquant
is
de la solution,
blocker
peut-être que la plus
to
importante,
find a solution,
c'est
maybe
la
the most
répartition
important is
territoriale.
the territorial
aujourd'hui,
divide
la
or
dimension
division. But today,
religieuse
the religious aspect
fondamentale.
is
La
also
dimension
crucial.
symbolique
The symbolical
sur Al-Aqsa
aspect
est
on
fondamentale.
Al-Aqsa is also
Le fait
essential. The
d'épurer
fact
le
of
passé. Vous avez
getting
un
rid of
choc
the
de
past,
deux
where
narratifs
you have the shock of
complètement
two
différents.
storytelling
l'histoire
or narrations that are totally different.
Le début du sionisme
Since
depuis
the
le congrès
beginning
de
of
Berne,
Zionism, the
donc depuis
Berne,
1896-97 avec Herzl,
with Herzl,
le narratif arabe et
the
le narratif
storytelling, the Arab storytelling and the
israélien
Jewish or
sont
Israeli
complètement
storytelling are
différents.
completely
Et donc,
different.
de temps en temps,
Thus,
ça se rencontre
sometimes
et ça
they
s'entrechoque.
meet and there's a shock.
Merci. Merci. Voilà.
Thank you very much.
Tu peux nous en parler pendant des heures.
I know you could carry on for hours, but and we would listen to you, but we have only 30 minutes left, so we'll listen to your questions because I have no doubt that we have some in the room.
Voilà, allez-y. Oui, allez-y.
Please go ahead.
J'ai les lumières dans les yeux, donc
I
pardon.
have some light in my eyes, so it's not a political choice if I don't see some of you.
Bonjour.
Alors des questions courtes, bien sûr.
Short questions, please.
Vous avez commencé tout à l'heure votre intervention
You
par
started
dire
by
que c'est un
saying
sujet très lourd.
that this is a heavy
Il n'est
topic,
pas évident. Alors, il n'est pas évident pour nous tous parce
so
que
it's not easy for all of
automatiquement,
us.
ça nous renvoie vers notre
Systematically,
propre
this
subjectivité à un
is
certain moment.
sending
Mais
us
en
back
étant
to
tout
our
à
own
fait
subjectivity,
objectif, j'ai
but
envie de dire que c'est mon âme
as
française.
being objective, my French soul, I'm French, I'm a French citizen, I heard things with which I agreed, other things with which I disagreed. We haven't heard in this context a number of things in which we are now.
Certes, tout ce que vous avez dit, on peut être d'accord, ça peut être discuté.
Yes, we could be in agreement. Since 98, I've been going to Israel and to Palestine since 98. There hasn't been 1 year when we did not go there since 98. I'm not going to ask. Okay, ask your question, please. Please ask your question. I just want to tell you why I go there, because I'm taking young French people there from different religious backgrounds. We meet Israeli, we meet Palestinians, to make sure that those who are prevented from meeting together can meet through an organization. We try to build a dialogue between those young people. But at the moment, we cannot not talk of the ministers of Israel, of the government of Israel. It is not possible not to talk. It's not possible to talk about this war and not talk about the government of Israel. There are terrorists, there are people who have attacked civilians. Recently, I was in a demonstration for peace, and we met a woman. We found her body burnt in a kibbutz next to Gaza afterwards. This was very shocking to us. Okay, please ask your question. So the question is, why here in France do we forget who we are? We are the country of light, the country of values. Why don't we say everything? Okay, thank you, thank you.
On va prendre plusieurs questions.
Let's take a number of questions first, and then we will have a grouped answer. Please go ahead. In the future, how can the status of Jerusalem evolve? How can the status of Jerusalem, situation of Jerusalem evolve in the future? In less than 1 minute, can we get an answer? Okay, let's take about 3 or 4 questions at once. Another question, please. We haven't spoken of Abdallah II and his country. What does he want for his country, and what can he do for the region? We're talking about Jordania here, okay? Thank you. First series of answers, short answers, please. Let's take 3 questions at a time. Okay, one more question. Sorry, go ahead. And then we'll have a range of answers. What about the Christian situation in Lebanon, with a large religious diversity in that country? In Lebanon, there is a large religious diversity.
Une forte diversité religieuse.
Une forte diversité religieuse, d'accord.
So what about Christians in Lebanon? That's the question. Okay, Joseph, in 4 minutes. 2 minutes.
Le statut de Jérusalem est une
Okay, Jerusalem is one of the most touchy issues that can ever be. Jerusalem was conquered, was founded by various people groups and the Israelites, etc., etc. And then since 637, it became essentially a Muslim city because of the Muslim conquest from the peninsula. But the Ottoman people, in the end, fixed the status of Jerusalem dating back from January 8, 1852, the status of statu quo, meaning that the Ottoman authority distributed the access to the holy places. There are churches, you have the sepulchre, you have various churches, so they were distributed, and then you have offices at given times in advance to make sure that everyone's happy and there would be no friction. And because Christians used to fight a lot, the Ottoman Sultan gave the key of the Holy Sepulchre to a Muslim family who still has those keys from generation to generation. Then you have the Temple Mount, the Mount Temple, the mosque esplanade for the Muslim. This is the same place where there is a mosque where you have the public prayer, common prayer on Friday, every Friday. So this place is dedicated only to Muslim prayer. Then after the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967, the Israelites and Israeli had access to the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall is the only wall that remains after 2,000 years following the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the 70s. So the statu quo is very important. Jordanians were the people who were making sure that the statu quo was respected after the Ottoman regime left. So this was the status of Jerusalem. Now this is being questioned again, and this is explosive. So the Hamas leaders explained why they had given the name of Aqsa Typhon to Jerusalem, because the Netanyahu government and the two ministers had decided to change things, change the game, and decided that they wanted to go and pray on the mosque esplanade. So we are in a conflict today where it seems, at least for Palestinians, it seems to them that the statu quo is being questioned again, and that there would be a derogation to an exclusive access for praying times at the mosque. And for the ultra-Orthodox, they like the idea of being able to go and pray on the mountain, on the Temple Mount. The UNESCO Commission has to be said that the Muslim countries don't call it the Wailing Wall, but they call it the Burak Wall. This is a horse. Burak is a horse, Mahomet's horse, on which Mahomet would have gone through a mystical journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, where he tied, presumably, tied his horse to the Wailing Wall. And that's when he would have had a mystical journey to the seventh heaven. So the Muslim, through the religious bias, have developed a genealogy in their relationship to Jerusalem. And I will end with this. Jerusalem, before the Muslims were praying towards Mecca, it had been ordered to the first Muslim to pray towards Jerusalem initially. For people who were familiar, this was the first Qibla, the first place where people would turn to. Then they disagreed with other Muslims from Medina, and then Mecca became the place that people turned to pray. Diversity of religion in Lebanon. Now, this is a complicated situation with the Shiites and the various Muslim movements, the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Shiites. There's a lot of divisions there, and a great diversity, which is harmed at the same time. Lebanon is not a federal state. People are raising their voices today to say, why should we not have a federation, shifting from a model like the French model to a model of a community-based. Therefore, the future in Lebanon is very uncertain to that extent. We have seen a great solidarity within Lebanon during the bombing in the south of the country, where people opened up their homes to refugees from the south. In a few days, 300 to 4,000 people from the south of Lebanon left to go to the north of Lebanon towards Beirut. Therefore, the situation is explosive when it comes to humanitarian aspects. One quick word regarding the question on the King of Jordania. The King of Jordania is a bit shaken on both sides because of the statu quo of Jerusalem that is being questioned, because there was a family from Jordania that was a protector of the holy places in Jerusalem. So therefore, questioning this status, because the ministers of the Israeli government are questioning this status, and Jordania was very much marginalized as a state, as a second state that had signed a real peace treaty we're speaking of the Abraham agreements and the peace treaty, but it is not really a peace treaty. We can't really call it a peace treaty. These are more some kind of arrangements between Morocco and Western Sahara, the United Emirates, against some armaments which they still haven't received from the US, etc. And a high-tech cooperation with Israel. So in all of this, the king of Jordania, Abdallah II, is in great difficulty, and lately there were elections in Jordania, and the Brotherhood in Jordan and the Muslim Brothers won a lot more votes than usual.
Alors, je voulais répondre à la question sur le statut de Jérusalem.
Regarding the status of Jerusalem, the first thing to be said, and I don't have the answer how to solve this issue of the status of Jerusalem. It is so complex. In order to get to the Oslo agreements in 1993, they had put aside the issue of Jerusalem to make sure they could come to an agreement. But there was another agreement that was negotiated in 1995 for a long time between the Israeli minister and Mahmoud Abbas, with some highly technical details in order to reach a solution of two states with an option regarding the status of Jerusalem, and I won't go into details, but pretty much they say that Jerusalem should be kept as a unified capital, but on one side a Palestinian capital, and on the other hand the Israeli capital, but with a common council. So there are some bases here which could be used again. Now, regarding what I have observed in the development of Jerusalem, especially the Temple Mount and the access to the mosque Al-Aqsa, the last time I went there, I saw a clear development. Tourists go through a different door through the Wailing Wall. Now you have Israeli guides who are giving tours of the mosque. Therefore, tourists no longer are allowed to go to the Al-Aqsa mosque since that change. But little by little, there is a control that is taken back by the Israeli. I met the Palestinian minister in charge of Jerusalem, and he said that Jerusalem would end up like Jaffa. Jaffa is a district in Tel Aviv that is completely controlled now by Israel, which is now even part of Tel Aviv, a very trendy district. And he was saying that if it goes on like this, that Jerusalem would end up like Jaffa, being part of an Israeli city.
Oui, alors, juste d'abord sur le fait qu'on n'en parle pas, bon, peut-être que vous estimez...
The fact that we are not talking about this, or maybe you think we don't talk about this enough, but in French administration, foreign affairs, and with everything I have written, if I had to say it again, let's say it again, but in order to have the majority at the Knesset of 64 voices out of 120 voices, Netanyahu joined some extremists, otherwise he would not have had a majority. Now, the two people who symbolize these trends are supremacists, racist people, who are the heirs, the ideological heirs of those who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. Back then, they were already demonstrating in the streets, claiming that Yitzhak Rabin was the one giving away territories. Yet these people want to hang on to these territories, meaning that they are in favor of the greater Israel, because the promised land is the one that should be recuperated. So you do have people who are always and always will be opposed to a two-state solution. Now the question is, are they a majority or not? Now coming back to Jerusalem, from an angle that has not yet been mentioned, and that is the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. this is to become in the future, because at the moment he's frozen by the current war, but I think in the future it will continue. Now, the key question is, besides a political normalization between Riyadh and Jerusalem, could there be also room for a religious normalization? And we would need to explain that this is a strengthened dialogue between Islam and Judaism, a normalization between Mecca and Jerusalem. Could there be such normalization in terms of dialogue? This is not impossible. There could be such a dimension. I'm more in the idea that deep down, and yet this is not documented, this is just an impression following some discussions, personal discussion that I've had. I think he wouldn't mind recuperating the Al-Aqsa Mosque, because he already has 2 holy places, and the third one has been handed over to Jordan because of yet another treason. Jordan being quite weak and having failed in its management of the mosque, because now the Israelis are controlling the mosque. I'm talking of the mosque at large. I'm not talking about just the Al-Aqsa. I'm talking about the whole of the esplanade in terms of religious matters. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the day they would say that these walls, that this good, this common good of public interest that could be entrusted for a long period to any authority. At the moment, Jordan is in charge, but I'm not sure that one day... Let me tell you something quick. One day I mentioned this in Riyadh, and I was saying, what about Jordan? And my person told me, the person told me, Hashemites, they don't care. Saudi people are the lords of the peninsula, but compared to Jordanians, they are in a relationship of power. I wouldn't be surprised that in the long term this would have an effect on the mosque.
Thank you very much. 3 more questions. Okay, so I'd like to congratulate the gentleman from Aubervilliers, who's behind me, who spoke up to talk about his experience and on the ground by taking often young people to Israel and Palestine. I never had, unfortunately, the opportunity to go to the region, but we cannot talk about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict without coming back to the origins of colonialism, because the question of Israel and Palestine is a leftover from colonialism that has existed since the 19th century. I'm coming to my question. Isn't it urgent
de faire pression sur l'État
israélien, on the Israeli state,
notamment n'en déplaise à monsieur l'ambassadeur d'Israël.
Moi,
amplifier le boycott, le désinvestissement.
Well, you want to put pressure on Israel, is that it? And the sanctions on the Zionist state.
Quand la France,
When is France
enfin notamment et les États-Unis vont-ils cesser de livrer des armes à Israël pour arrêter le massacre du peuple palestinien et libanais?
Je vous rassure tout de suite là-dessus, on ne vend pas d'armes en Israël, on n'en a jamais vendu. J'ai même essayé,
I even tried to, even a Rafale, and I cannot even sell a tire of a Rafale there. The market is entirely to the Americans. So let's stop about selling armament, French armaments. It's not non-existing. Second question. We'll take two other questions. I had a question concerning Lebanon. It's a question that involves several answers, given the diversity and the number of religions in Lebanon. But I wanted to know what the opinion of the Lebanese is on Hezbollah. What do they think about it? I think this is for you. Let's take a last question. What you said, and you were right to talk about the lack of unity between the Arab world. What is also missing is to bring a nuance to the Israeli world. Madame Durieux, I think you could answer to this question. When we talk about ultra-Orthodox people, we don't necessarily think small groups that are not necessarily favorable to the existence of Israel and Eretz Israel, for example. So I wanted your opinion. So unity of the Israeli opinion as well. Okay, Joseph, on the previous question. Yes, very quickly. So in the current situation, there's no poll to know of opinion, to know what public opinion thinks concerning the positioning vis-à-vis Hezbollah. What we need to know is that the Hezbollah is a party, the party of the Shiite community, the community that was very close to Iran. If Iran is close to Hezbollah, it's that the two belong to this Shiite community, which is duodecimin, the one that recognizes a line of 12 imams. Second point, which is also interesting and to bear in mind, during the last elections, the Shiite community, which has 27 deputies in the parliament in Lebanon, the Lebanese parliament, giving seats depending to different communities. The two parties, Amal and Hezbollah, who are allies that are very close, have won the 27 seats. So we can say that the representation of the community, Shiite community in the Lebanese parliament is in total occupied by these two parties. They have a great mobilization. These people were left abandoned in terms of economic development in what we had called at a given time before Lebanon collapsed, the Lebanon miracle. In the time where we talked about Lebanon as the Switzerland of the Middle East, if you come back to these cliches. And Hezbollah has fed this desire to leave this underdevelopment state, and the mobilization went in that way. The question now is arise to what about the rest of the Lebanese people? The Christians are not very favorable. The Sunnites have engaged in a fight that doesn't say its name between the Sunnites and Shiites. And this is in the great reproach on the political level. Eric Danon reminded us of it. On the 7th of October, the attack by the Hamas. On the 8th of October, a man was on TV, Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, and who declared, without consulting anyone, without going to the parliament, without seeing what the government thinks, he opens a support against Israel. Immediately, public opinion said, how can you decide on your own? How do you wage war alone? It's a drama. We need to avoid it. There's a movement that came together saying, we do not want this war. This is not our war. But the Hezbollah is super powerful. It's a community that has 27 deputies. The only one, to my knowledge, as a politologist, the only representation in the parliament in the world that can claim to have an army, a parliamentary group that has an army, a real army. And the armament from all the other militias were suppressed. Hezbollah is truly in a strong position within the Lebanese territory. So this is the situation we have. Now on diversity of opinion in Israel, maybe very quickly, and a last question for all of you to answer in 1 or 2 sentences. I know it's not an easy task. Very quickly about diversity of opinion in Israel. I didn't mention it before, but before October 7th, let's not forget that the Israeli opinion was fractured. As I said before, it's very difficult to have them speak about the Palestinian issue. On the other hand, criticism against Netanyahu, no issue to talk about it, no problem there. The population was very fractured, very critical vis-à-vis this government, with ultra-Orthodox and nationalist parties entered, as the ambassador said. One of the effects of October 7th is that it reunified the population in Israel. Today, we are starting to see, in a very short time, we see demonstrations, but what is interesting is that these demonstrations are not against the Netanyahu government, neither against the atrocities committed in Gaza, but in favor of having the hostages come back. Maybe I'd like to add a detail with what Eric Danon said. You talked about Saudi Arabia, who secretly would like to collect Al-Aqsa, one idea at least, and I have met the sheikh in charge, the sheikh inside of the esplanade of the mosques, and I asked the question, what in the case of a standardization or normalization, wouldn't you fear to lose the control that you have? He had a similar reaction to that you described of the Saudi. He just answered out of the question. The last question, maybe very quickly for all of you. We need to conclude and leave the room quickly. It's 3 minutes before 6. Maybe a simple and complicated question. Can France do anything faced with this situation? We had a last question for the ambassador. You mentioned several reasons for which Arab countries do not want peace with Israel, namely because of the Palestinian cause, but you haven't tackled the reasons why Israel doesn't want peace. What are, for you, the interests and motivations that would prevent this specific solution there? One question, very easy. In fact, there were several attempts when there were governments that were favorable to the creation of a Palestinian state. It wasn't structural. But in the year 2000, there were 7 attempts, 7 proposals that were always refused in the end. The story will remember that the ones and the others refused. In fact, you had with a government that refuses a solution that would go through the creation of a Palestinian state. This doesn't mean that the government which was there 2 years before with Lapid and Bennett, was against this solution. So you have something that is contractual for Israel and structural for the Arab countries, not even Palestinians, because the Palestinians themselves are like everybody else. They only dream of having a state, being at peace. And when my students, the Hebrew University, my Palestinians, in the last course, I said, what do you really want? And these are true Palestinians, not Arabs in Israel. They take 3 hours to go to the Hebrew University. The answer came up immediately, the end of the occupation, the end of humiliation, same dignity for all. And in the conversation, they all said, we want to live like they do. We want a house, we want a family, we want a job. And after 15 minutes, I told them, don't you want a state? And the delegate of the class said, I don't want a state, I want a future.
La question de l'État palestinien pour les jeunes n'est pas la question.
So for young people, state is not the main question. It's not the main question. They have no future. That is the real question and drama today for this. Maybe Marie, for France, one word?
Que peut faire la France?
What can France do? Not much.
Non,
That
mais
was short,
la France
indeed.
a
No, France has
une toute petite
a
possibilité
very small
au
possibility
niveau encore d'une certaine influence au Liban. Et
having
encore,
a certain
et encore. Hein, franchement, je parierais pas
influence in
là-dessus.
Lebanon, but I wouldn't bet on
Autrement, non.
it.
Le système s'est
Otherwise,
tellement
no, the system has
radicalisé en
radicalized
matière
to such an
de
extent
guerre et de
in
paix.
terms of
La
war and
France
peace.
doit
France
s'allier avec
must
tout le monde pour
ally
faire
with
pression sur
everyone
les
to
uns et les
put
autres,
pressure
surtout proposer
on
des
others
choses
and
raisonnables.
offer reasonable
Et
things
aujourd'hui,
or solutions.
elle n'a pas
Today,
de façon
it has
autonome
no
un poids dans
autonomous
cette affaire.
way or weight to do it.
Très rapidement,
Very
je
quickly,
pense que le risque
I
principal
believe that the
pour la France
main
et pour
risk
les
for
Européens,
France and even
c'est
for
qu'autour du
Europeans
conflit
is that around this
israélo-palestinien
Israeli-Palestinian
la
conflict,
fracture qui est en train
this
de se
crystallized the
redessiner
fracture
entre
that is
les démocraties
redefined between
occidentales et ce
Western
qu'on appelle
democracies
un
and what
sud
we call
global
the
ou
global
émergent
south
ou
or
les régimes
emerging south
autoritaires.
or authoritarian regimes.
Autour de sa position
Around its
sur le
position
conflit
on
israélo-palestinien,
the
la France et l'Europe
Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
se positionnent en réalité dans cette espèce de
fact,
nouvel
they
ordre mondial
place
qui est en
themselves
train de se redessiner avec
in this
cette
new
logique
order
de
that is
bloc que
redefining
certains
itself
comme
with
la
a bloc,
Russie
like
encouragent
some like
d'ailleurs.
Russia
Et je pense que ce
encourage.
n'est pas dans l'intérêt de
And
la
I think
France
that
ni de
France
l'Europe,
doesn't have any
cette
interest,
fracture et cette
neither
logique
does
de bloc. Et je
Europe
pense
in
que la
this
France doit
fracture.
adopter
I think
une
France
voie
will adopt
singulière qu'elle
a
a su
singular
avoir en
path that
2003
it had
et comme à
in
l'époque,
2003
rayonnait en parlant à
when
toutes les
it
nations. Je pense
outbeamed,
qu'elle doit se
and it
repositionner,
must reposition
essayer de ne pas
itself
tomber dans cette
and
logique
not
de
fall
bloc et cette
into
fracture qui est
this
en train de se
rational or
redessiner.
logics of a
Merci.
bloc that is
Fadia.
being redefined.
Fadia.
Alors la France pourrait également
So
rebondir
France
sur,
could rebound,
contrairement à ce que
and
disait
contrarily to what
Monsieur
Mr. the Ambassador said, an initiative that was extremely important is the Arab Peace Initiative, which was adopted, yes, it was adopted in 2002, 2005, 2007. The 22 state members of the Arab League recognized Israel, normalized with Israel, and in exchange of peace against land, to know a Palestinian state with its borders before the 4th June of 1967.
Alors, Joseph, que peut faire la France pour finir
What can France do?
Voilà, très rapidement. Alors, la France est
So
profondément
France
depuis
is
toujours
deeply
impliquée
involved
dans cette
and
région
has been
du Proche-Orient.
forever in this region of the Middle East. On the one hand, it is deeply involved in religious questions, since France has possessions, so to speak, religious possessions in Palestine and Israel. This facilitates a permanent dialogue. Secondly, France is involved in Lebanon. Yesterday, there was former Minister Le Drian who is in reconciliation with Lebanon, and today the President has sent the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Lebanon. France is involved also in the preparation of exiting the crisis and coming back to the Resolution 1701 in this resolution of the conflict, which means strengthening the presence of the FINULA, this army, Blue
dont
helmets,
les forces françaises sont la colonne
French forces
vertébrale.
without its
S'il n'y avait pas
spinal
de
cord.
forces françaises,
Without
la
these
situation
French
au
forces,
sud,
the situation in the south,
maintenant totalement
which is
dépassée,
now
aurait été complètement incontrôlable.
different,
Et c'est
would be
grâce à la
totally
France
uncontrollable.
et à ses
And it's thanks
contacts,
to France and its
effectivement,
contacts that
entre
indeed
Libanais et Israéliens, entre le Hezbollah et
what is happening
Israël,
between
entre
Lebanon and
les
Israel,
Libanais
between
entre eux,
Hezbollah,
la France
Israel,
maintient
France is
fondamentalement ce
maintaining
lien,
this
avec, bien entendu,
connection, this
une
link,
coopération avec
and
les
a
États-Unis.
cooperation with the United
Les
States.
États-Unis et
The United
Israël
States
sont
and
dans une
Israel
logique de
are in
coopération,
a rational of a
rivalité, mais fondamentalement sur le
rivalry,
fond de coopération pour essayer de
but
trouver
a
une solution
cooperation to
à la
find a
crise
solution
libanaise
to
et à
the
la crise
Lebanese crisis and the
Écoutez, c'était
Palestinian
un débat
crisis.
vraiment
Well, it was an
exceptionnel sur un sujet
exceptional
très
debate
difficile.
on a very difficult
Très
topic.
difficile. Le sujet est difficile depuis longtemps, mais
It has
il est
been a difficult
particulièrement
theme
en ce
for
moment.
a very long
Donc,
time,
vraiment,
but especially
merci,
today.
à tous les
So
quatre.
a great
Merci à
thank
vous
you
qui
to
avez
all four of
assisté.
you and to
Bonne
all of you who came
continuation
to
dans ces
be
forums.
present in this room.